Hi everyone, I think we're ready to get started. Maybe people trickle in. I'm Izzy Kornblad, a PhD student in architecture here and one of the organizers of this year's Architecture Forum lecture series. A big thank you to Devin for doing a lot of the logistics for this talk. It's my pleasure to welcome you all back from spring break to our second forum talk of this semester and to introduce today's speaker, Enrique Ramírez. Enrique is currently the Francis and Gilbert P. Schaefer Visiting Professor of Architecture at the Taubman College at the University of Michigan. He received a BA in History from Northwestern University and a JD in Public and Private International Law from the George Washington University Law School. After studying urban planning at UCLA, he received his MED here and a PhD in the History and Theory of Architecture at Princeton, where he was a Whiting Scholar. His work, which considers histories of buildings, environments, and landscapes alongside larger cultures of textual, literary, and object production in Europe and the Americas from the Renaissance onwards, has been recognized and supported by various organizations, including the Canadian Center for Architecture, the Institute for Historical Studies at the University of Texas, Austin, and most recently, the Graham Foundation. But the way that I became familiar with Enrique's work was actually through the series of excellent critical essays that he has contributed to shorter form publications, like the Architect's Newspaper and the New York Review of Architecture, which I highly recommend reading for anyone interested in criticism. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Enrique back to Yale for his talk, Iceblink Space, Photography, Architecture, and International Law in the Circumpolar North. And do stick around afterward for pizza and drinks.
Thank you. Thank you to the organizers. It's always, I have a very soft spot in my heart for the Yale School of Architecture, so it's always great to be back here. I just want to share one memory of being in this room was when I organized the MED Spring Colloquium, and we invited DJ Spooky to come speak to our class. And he was in this room with his rig playing drum solos from the first Slayer album really loud. And I was really hoping Bob Stern was going to come in here and just start yelling at us to turn it down. I have a picture somewhere, but it's a really interesting thing because if I were to show it, there are going to be some familiar people in that picture, much younger. And a lot more hair. So without further ado, let me start. So, excuse me, water. So,
I need to click into it.
Okay. There it is. Okay, so sometime in the spring of 1892, Alfred Lee Broadbent, an assistant engineer aboard the United States revenue cutter Bear, leaned on the port gunwale and pointed a camera towards the horizon. Something caught his eye. He thought it was another service cutter, perhaps the Thomas Corwin, on which he was occasionally assigned, or the revenue cutter Rush, or perhaps a whaler trapped in the ice floes. He thought of the various silhouettes made by ships and ice formations while aboard other vessels. This object was different. It was broad, it was towering, like a broken tree trunk in the middle of the ice. He used a transit scope to get a better look and saw that it was a giant rock rising from the water. And then hanging the camera from his neck, he allowed the back of its casing to rest along his waistline. Using the camera's external sighting scope, he shifted his body until the object was in the middle of the crosshairs. It barely moved, either an indication that the rock was very far away or that it was moving on a course perpendicular to the bear. Quickly, Broadbent opened the camera's sighting prism and through the smoked glass saw the rock pointing upside down towards the earth and blurry. He moved the bellows to adjust. He found a desired level of sharpness, closed the panel, and once again let the camera rest on his waist. He kept steady, holding his breath, allowing the camera's heft to settle firmly. Broadbent counted to 3 and pulled the lever. The click was not loud, but in the still Alaska air, it sounded like a ringing bell. Not long after the end of this voyage, when the revenue cutter Bear returned to San Francisco, Broadbent took his camera to a photographic studio at 121 Post Street above Hibernia Bank. The studio belonged to Isaiah West Tabor, who set up shop there around 1864. Before then, Tabor had a bit of a picturesque life, perhaps a kind that someone like Broadbent would find entertaining. Tabor was born in New Bedford, Massachusetts, the center of the American whaling industry. At 19, he joined the crew of the whaler Adeline Gibbs. And once aboard, Tabor saw much of the North Pacific, and at one time traveling as far north as the Bering Strait. He arrived in San Francisco in 1850 at the height of the California gold rush and established a company that specialized in trading gold and other minerals. This concern took him on lengthy travels along the Pacific, and from this he created his own triangular trade network between South America, the South Pacific, and San Francisco. On one voyage, for example, Tabor took a gold shipment to Valparaiso, Chile, which he traded for ammunition and gunpowder, and then sailed to the Marquesas in exchange for a shipment of wild hogs, which he would in turn take back to San Francisco and sell for their meat. In 1852, Tabor was back in California working as a ranch hand, and for the next year or so, he continued bouncing around the country, specializing in different kinds of jobs. And around 1854, Tabor was back in New Bedford working as a dentist. He spent his free time taking courses in photography at a nearby Ambrotype studio until 1857, when he married Mary Howland, sister to the renowned photographer Benjamin Howland. And Howland and Tabor ran a successful photography gallery in Syracuse until 1862. Isaiah then joined his brother Freeman to form the Tabor Brothers Photographic Studio. And in 1864, the San Francisco photographers, Henry William Bradley and William Herman Willifson, encouraged Tabor to move back to San Francisco to run the gallery. Tabor agreed, eventually establishing his own successful studio practice there in 1871. Tabor was a noted photographer of the American West. His studio was a clearinghouse for new photographic techniques as well, a place that attracted customers from all over the world with money to burn and desirous of fame. Whether having one's portrait taken at the Tabor Studios or taking classes with Isaiah himself, Tabor's name had a kind of auratic effect. One went to his studio, not just for a portrait, but for a Tabor portrait. His reputation transcended borders and oceans. In the 1880s, Tabor included Hawaiian King Kalakua and the Japanese photographer Suzuki Shinichi as client and student, respectively. Now, when Broadbent arrived at Tabor's studio in 1892, he encountered a photographer at the height of his fame and influence. Yet Tabor was more than this. And for his studio business, this too transcended its original mission. He was hired by the Yosemite Park Commission to document the state of various natural features there. His efforts in documenting the world of the Pacific coast from South America to Alaska turned him into a documentarian, an archivist of an image of a world that was changing quickly. Tabor quickly developed Broadbent's photographs as part of a series of albums documenting the activities of the United States Revenue Service in the Alaskan and the Siberian frontier. The photograph of the rock taken from the U.S. revenue cutter Bear appears in a larger set of leather-bound titles entitled Photograph Albums of the United States Revenue Cutter Service in Alaska and Siberia, published in 1895. And it appears on page 44 with a handwritten inscription at the bottom, New Eddystone, 260 feet high, which tells us that the object that Broadbent captured in his camera was New Eddystone Rock, a giant granite protuberance discovered by Captain George Vancouver in 1791. As he would describe it 7 years later in his book, A Voyage of Discovery to the North Pacific Ocean and Around the World, he encountered, quote, a small round island resembling a ship under sail, and then he called it New Eddystone from its resemblance to the lighthouse off Plymouth. There was part of me that found this description of a natural formation in terms of architecture rather beguiling. And this made me think of other coincidences when architectural metaphors can provide a useful historical purview. One that is relevant to this talk is I will be talking here a little later about the architectural and spatial languages embedded in the history of shipbuilding and ship thinking. I'm reminded, for instance, that the main mast of a ship was the gratte-ciel, or skyscraper. But in looking at these images from Broadbent's book, a different kind of story emerged. And this story is perhaps familiar to those of you sitting in this room. So let me put it in this way. So to my magpie imagination, the images inside these books are all parts of a series of interlocking histories. Nautical architecture and its relation to terrestrial architecture is only part of the story. These were books, after all, and photographic ones at that, which of course leads me to wonder how these images were part of a kind of technologization of the frontier. And such an approach is not new. I only point you to writings by Rebecca Solnit or Jennifer R. Roberts, whose essential wide-ranging works help us understand how visual culture in the American 19th century depended on the transportability and reproducibility of images of nature. In other words, it was a mobile culture. And as I mentioned earlier, Broadbent's images are not only a document of a travel, but they are also documents that traveled, which, thanks to modern techniques, were reproduced, published, bound, and displayed. And moreover, these images are part of a larger story of how the aesthetic and technological cultures of photography documented and participated in the extension of territorial sovereignty. And in Broadbent's books, we also find a record of a part of the world at a threshold of environments and landscapes on the brink of change. To me, then, these photos in Broadbent's albums are, to paraphrase Thomas Pynchon's description of stamps from the Crine of Lot 49, little windows into deep vistas of space and time. And as I pored over these materials, over these captivating images of the Circumpolar North, of its various peoples and attendant architectures, of the plants, the rocks, the animals, the skies, the waters, the ice, I could not ignore the fact that Broadbent made these images during a time of unprecedented American colonial expansion. Nor could I lose sight of something else that was going on in these images, all related to the laws and customs indelibly woven into that institution that we just call land. Thing is, when looking at these photographs of these voyages in the Bering Strait region, they're not so much capturing individual moments or institutional purviews. These images, as ravishing and fascinating as they may seem, are more than evidence of something that resembles testamentary veracity. The truths embedded in these images are not ironclad. They're all captured from the point of view of a person with a camera. This, as Susan Sontag suggests, is the sine qua non of photography. In these photographs, however, we are seeing a world in flux. And flux is an important idea, or a foundational concept for this talk, because in these images, as much as we see the horizon lines diminish and blend earth into sky or water into the air, we're only catching glimpses of a world whose changes are part of larger and larger matrices of change. Therefore, it is not the moments of crisp resolution that are of interest here. No, it's those moments that are the exact opposite, that take us aback. Moments when a camera is out of focus, or when a subject moves in the frame as an exposure is being made. A blur appears, and yet that blur becomes a world into itself. In looking at all these photographs, I dwelled on the concept of phase change, or phase transition. The term, which comes from physics, describes the process of transition from one state to another. A solid becomes a liquid becomes a gas becomes plasma. And when thinking through these materials, when looking at these images taken by Alfred Lee Broadbent, I saw similar transitions. The photographic image turns a body in space into a smudge, a ship into a building, ice into land. Photographs, ships, and ice, three media that we use to apprehend this world in flux. Alfred Lee Broadbent's photographs have ended up in various repositories. The ones that I looked at, for example, are right here at Yale's Beinecke Library. Copies of these images are also found at the Huntington Library's photo archives, as well as the Library of Congress. But for the most part, these are images that are shrouded in some degree of anonymity. We know, for instance, that it was Alfred Lee Broadbent that took many of these images. Also, none of them are stereoscopic. And except for logs that show what vessels he was aboard on his Alaska travels, we know very little about him or about his life. We do know what he looked like, however. And in this photograph, taken sometime in the 1890s, showing the ornate interior of a revenue cutter's dining room while on the Bering Strait patrol, we see Broadbent seated sixth from the left. He's wearing the dress uniform of an assistant engineer of the United States Revenue Marine. Here's another picture of Broadbent, third from the left. Right. So the Revenue Marine was established in 1790 by Alexander Hamilton as a customs enforcement arm of the United States Treasury Department. Revenue Marine vessels patrolled the coastal waters. At the time, they were the only armed vessels belonging to the US government. Each of the major ports on the eastern seaboard had a handful of marine cutters, and their job was to prevent the trafficking of illegal cargo that violated customs laws. This, by the way, included slaves. The 1794 Slave Trade Act prohibited the construction or outfitting of ships for the international slave trade. Yet the importation of slaves in foreign vessels was not prohibited. And any American citizens found in violation of the act were only fined and not imprisoned. Revenue Marine vessels also took part in anti-piracy operations in the Caribbean, as well as the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, and the Civil War. And with the purchase of Alaska in 1867, the Revenue Marine expanded its fleet to include steam-powered cutters with ice-breaking capabilities. And when dispatched to the Alaskan frontier, the Revenue Marine cutters aided in surveying expeditions, pursuing poachers, and even took part in operations to rescue stranded vessels, explorers, Aleuts, Tlingits, and Inuits. Broadbent took these photographs when he was aboard the Revenue Marine's newest vessel, the United States Revenue Cutter Bear. And this ship began life as a sealer, that is, a ship exclusively designed for seal hunting. And it was made of dense 6-inch thick wooden planks reinforced with a steel prow. And it was purchased in 1884 by the Revenue Marine and deployed to the Bering Strait region of Alaska. And by 1895, the date of the publication of Broadbent's albums, the Revenue Cutter Bear was one of the most decorated ships, having taken part in many rescue operations, humanitarian missions, and in some instances acted as courthouses for the prosecution of poachers, and in one particular instance, a court-martial. The Bear was also unparalleled in its capacity to store coal. And for that reason, it replaced the revenue cutter Thomas Corwin while on the Bering Strait patrol. The Revenue Cutter Bear, it should be mentioned, was also the first vessel to be commanded by an African-American skipper. Michael Healy, otherwise known as Hell Roaring Mike, born in a plantation near Macon, Georgia in 1839, and there you see him with his pet parrot. So it's beyond the scope of this talk to go into a complete inventory of the photographs in Broadbent's album. However, they can be categorized according to some broad categories. In his travels aboard the Thomas Corwin and the Bear, Broadbent took photographs of a variety of buildings. They were courthouses and other government buildings in Washington Territory, as well as buildings and trading stations along the southern Alaskan coast and up through the crenellated chains of the Alexander Archipelago. There are also instances where images of buildings reveal how this part of the world was undergoing cultural transformations. A Russian Orthodox church on St. Paul Island, evidence of religious migration over the Bering Strait. Here's another picture of an Orthodox church in the landscape, as you can see here. And here's an old Russian blockhouse, as the image says here. Or even, here's another Orthodox building in this part of the world, as you can see here. Or here, the underside of a wharf in Port Townsend, encrusted with marine life, appearing as a sunken ruin shot through with bolts of light. There are also Inuit buildings and shelters. There are graves, homes clustered on rocky cliffs, summer bolt holes for storing provisions, and there are even hybrid sites erected with totems around large settler homes. Yet some of the information about these images is inaccurate, as when Broadbent uses the exonym Eskimo to refer to structures that belong to Tlingit and Inuit peoples alike. Or as in the case with this 10-sided building that Broadbent identifies as a school in Port Chester, it is actually the town hall for the town of Metlaklata. These lapses in attribution and misinterpretations are fascinating to me. On the one hand, they only confirm what we already know about the early history of photography, namely that it was primarily a neophyte's medium, which is to say that the camera became a kind of extension of the sensorium, a device that eschews veracity in favor of the photographer's enthusiasm for a subject. However, these imperfections become more meaningful when considering Broadbent's other images. So while on the Bering Strait patrol, Broadbent took photographs of people, and these images vary in terms of their resolution. The images of families, of crew members, these are for the most part clear and readable, perhaps because there are people who by the 1880s and 1890s were already familiar with daguerreotype portraiture. They knew how to stand still. And though it is also easy to attribute this relative clarity to technological advances from improved wet plate collodion, dry plate exposures, faster lenses, etc., how then to account for instances when the Aleuts, Inuits, Tlingits, or any other indigenous people of the Circumpolar North, how do we account for their blurry appearance? Part of me sees them as revenants. At least for some of these subjects, there seems to be an unwillingness to be recorded. And this is not the case with the Mission Indians, local populations who converted to Christianity, or presumably in some cases Russian Orthodoxy. Nor is it the case with mixed race children who appeared disciplined. Nor is it so with the mixed race crew of the revenue cutter Bear. And in some instances, indigenous people appear blurry. When they appear, they turn their heads away from the camera as the image is being made. It reads as defiance, as if the subject is unwilling to be that, a subject, and is recorded as an elusive blur that escapes the camera eye. Here, it is worth recalling that at the time of the making of these images, photography was barely 50 years old. And yet in that relatively brief amount of time, a remarkable set of advancements gave the art and science of taking photographs unparalleled testamentary veracity, a kind that, as described by William Ivins Jr., eclipsed reason as the primary mode for knowing the world. Moreover, photography was an elemental and geological medium. This is to say that it was extractive, dependent on the mining of minerals and their manufacturing and processing into various chemicals with desirable photosensitive qualities, silver nitrate for albumin prints, calotype and wet collodion processes, Syrian bitumen or bitumen asphalt preferred by Niepce for his heliographs, mercury vapors for daguerreotypes, gallic and phosphoric acids for zincography, copper salts, gum oil, and bichromate albumin. There's more. All evidence that the medium of photography was dependent on a chemical regime and industrial armature to support it. And this is a concept that has been marvelously explored in Siobhan Angus's brand new book, Camera Geographica, An Elemental History of Photography, which I just finished reading, and it is quite marvelous. So from its earliest moments, then, photography was an act of earth, to borrow again from Thomas Pynchon, but this time from his 1997 novel, Mason and Dixon. Conceptually, photography was also rooted in the picturesque. Take, for instance, William Gilpin's manuals on picturesque composition from the 1790s, whose instructions for sketching clumps of trees almost relied on the word fix to describe that impossible desire to halt time so that the artist can properly draw a subject, a wish for a landscape frozen by dint of some process and technique. So frozen. The term seems rather appropriate for this talk because in some ways, the Circumpolar North, by which I mean those areas above 70 degrees north latitude, become an important proving ground for some of the earliest photographic technologies. The desire to test this equipment came on the heels of two important developments. The first is the expansion of industrial whaling beginning in the early 19th century, which turned cities like New Bedford, Massachusetts, San Francisco, and Honolulu into important centers in the global whaling industry. These cities, in turn, were host to a thriving culture of photography studios where customers would line up for hours to pose for daguerreotypes or enter photographic rooms to view images of faraway places taken by crew members on ocean-going vessels. This would explain, for example, Isaac Tabor's travels between New Bedford, San Francisco, and Honolulu. Photography, in short, became a kind of service industry dependent on the movement of animals, peoples, ships, oils, and chemicals across oceans. The whaling industry and its attendant cultures of photography set the stage for a second development that also contributed to the spread of photography in the Circumpolar North. Whaling and photography provided the necessary infrastructures for polar expeditions. A little over a year after their introduction, daguerreotype equipment became a common fixture on manifests for polar expedition vessels. It is, however, difficult to tell whether such equipment was ever used for taking images of landscapes. To get a sense of this, we can look at the doomed Franklin expedition from 1845. In May of that year, Sir John Franklin, a veteran of the Napoleonic Wars, led two vessels, the HMS Erebus and the HMS Terror, in an effort to map the Arctic coastlines in search of a northwest passage. Both vessels were lost, and not much was known about the fate of the expedition for a very long time. However, we know from various accounts, indeed, that Franklin was aware of daguerre and his invention. So as early as 1840, we find the naturalist Sir John Richardson, Franklin's friend and fellow explorer, writing about the existence and use of daguerreotype processes. This is from a letter dated to Franklin, dated 5 February 1840. One of the most remarkable discoveries of modern times is the art of causing rays of light to act on oxides of silver so as to give minute representations of object placed in the focus of a camera obscura. The daguerreotype, as the instrument has been called from its discoverer, or at least its principal inventor, is so far improved that the images it produces are fixed. And a further step has been made of engraving it by means of galvanism, so that at a very moderate expense, the most minute representations of material objects may be multiplied and printed off. Plates of fossils have already been published, which bear inspection by a microscope. A common line engraving on copper may also be reproduced line for line by galvanism. The process is rapid and simple. A cast is taken from the engraved plate in Paris plaster. This is placed in a solution of blue vitriol or sulfate of copper, as it is named, and a galvanic current of two metals being formed. The pure copper is separated from the sulfate and deposited in the mold. In this way, the engraving is represented in relief. A cast of this being taken is submitted to the same process when a facsimile of the original plate is formed. An hour or two suffices for the whole process, and when I examined prints from the original and the copied plate, I could detect no difference. This is an interesting passage for sure, because in addition to describing an improved process for fixing the daguerreotype, it also outlines how the resulting image can be used to make copies. Daguerreotypes, as you may know, are one-off images. The image is developed directly on a polished plate. In other words, there's no negative from which successive copies can be made. Richardson's letter alludes to the making of copies of galvanically etched daguerreotypes for scientific illustrations of natural specimens. I note that this interest in mechanical reproduction followed rather quickly on Daguerre's announcement to the world that he had invented the technique that bears his name, the daguerreotype. Part of the reason is that as early as 1839, Daguerre licensed his process to the French government, allowing scientists and enthusiasts alike to modify and improve on this early photographic technique. This led to a flourishing of various discoveries in Germany, France, and England, all detailing the ways in which electricity could be used for the photomechanical reproduction of daguerreotypes. Now, as fascinating and interesting as these techniques are, and as much as they shed light on how photomechanical reproduction was quickly being explored even before the invention of negatives. We are not sure if the process outlined by Richardson was actually used. We do know, however, that a daguerreotypist from Richard Beard's studio came on board the HMS Erebus and made portraits of members of the crew, including one of Franklin. And in 2014, a research team of archaeologists and divers from Parks Canada discovered the remains of the HMS Erebus in Queen Maud Land. And among their discoveries was the polisher used to prepare the daguerreotype plates. The dimensions of the plate indicate that it was a type developed by John Johnson in 1841, which is designed for use with the smaller, more portable daguerreotype camera designed by Alexander Wolcott. Judging by the dimensions of the crew portraits, we know that a Wolcott-Johnson camera was provided for Franklin's 1845 expedition. Now, this episode only highlights the extent to which the exploration was linked indelibly to the early history of photography. It is also a reminder that the essential problems faced by explorers wanting to take photographers in this part of the world. The equipment needed for such endeavors could be heavy and space-consuming. Bottles and baths needed to store mercury salts and silver nitrates. Tents with baffles to prevent light leakage. The making of photographs required the outfitting for a mobile studio, in essence, the deployment of demountable architecture. Moreover, freezing temperatures made some photographic processes preferable to others. Daguerreotypes, for instance, may have provided the sharpest images, and yet the equipment could be cumbersome. And the iodine vapors needed to sensitize the plates worked best at warmer temperatures. This is important as daguerreotypes had to be prepared in situ. Early photography, therefore, needed constant environmental monitoring in the form of adjusting light and temperature controls. So in 1848, Sir John Richardson embarked on an overland expedition to find the remains of the HMS Erebus in Terror. And shortly before Richardson's departure, William Henry Fox Talbot loaned calotype equipment to Richardson, who in 1848 went in search of the remains of the HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. Calotypes, it should be said, were preferable because the sensitized salt print negative plates could be prepared beforehand and could make for easier travel before and after the making of the image. Broadbent's photographs, however, or albumen prints, introduced in 1847 by Louis Désiré Blancard et Rad, albumen photographic printing used a sheet of cotton dipped in an egg white and salt emulsion, which hardens and then is covered in a solution of silver nitrate. Shortly after the image is taken, it is fixed in a sodium thiosulfate bath. And sometimes there was an additional step of adding a gold or selenium toner to prevent fading. Now, the kinds of camera used by Broadbent is not known, but this image from the U.S. Coast Guard archives of an officer aboard the Bear during the Bering Strait patrol is instructive. Here we see an officer wearing a revenue service uniform holding a camera with a vertical viewfinder. And then you can see here one of Broadbent's cameras, photographs of a mission of a mission convert with a similar kind of press camera on a tripod. So when we see this image of a crew member on the deck of the revenue cutter Bear, when we see him there smiling beatifically, it's not difficult to imagine how we are interlopers, placed not in between two subjects, but between two cameras. And situated between them, we think of everything we know about this image, the ship, the uniform, and yet some of the most significant details, the date, the time of day, the camera model, the name of the subject, the photographer, these are lost. Everything about this image, from the rakish tilt to the mise en scène, seem unhurried, casual even. But even in this moment of apparent levity, we wonder what these men were trying to see with their camera. What were they trying to understand, or more importantly, what was it out there in the Iceblink that made them want to lug this strange equipment out to a distant world? We are in a part of the world that is, to a certain extent, unknown, which is to say that these photographers aboard the U.S. revenue cutter Bear, like those painters who decades earlier were billeted or even press ganged into service by dint of a desire to see a world unknown, this too has its precedence. And the topic of this early modern visual culture of the Arctic is the subject of Chris Hoyer's Into the White, the Renaissance Arctic, and the End of the Image, which is another book that I really, really recommend. So, and the earliest maps, of the Arctic, we have, for example, Mercator's marine map of the Northern Lands from 1595, which shows this realm as divided into 4 large landmasses, each outlined in colors corresponding to the lands in the Northern Hemisphere. Ice, or at least what was imagined as being ice, is here depicted as land. In the middle is a rock, a nod to Dante, perhaps. Or maybe the island of Laputa that appears at the beginning of Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, but a rock nonetheless, a realm into which waters from other parts of the world flow. This is where water comes together with other water, as Raymond Carver would have it. It was an unknown expanse, yet limned literally by their understanding of their own world. Which brings me to other fascinating depictions of this part of the world. Take, for instance, Vincenzo Cortinelli's Storia Arctica from 1691. Like Mercator's map, this too privileges the polar orientation. It is a map that tempers its speculative geographies with meticulous references to the known world. The North Pole is no longer a rocky outcropping, but is surrounded by areas by this ring of ice, these icy cliffs. And in William Jan Zumblow's map of the regions below the North Pole, the northernmost realms are ensnared by a portolan, right? Networks of delicate arabesques that spin around each other. And closer to those areas once patrolled by the revenue cutters Bear and James Corwin. And here we have Philippe Bois and Joseph Nicolas de Lisle's map of Siberia and the westernmost realms of New France, from the point of view of the North Pole, with lines emanating from an arc. This is a map that hypothesized a Northwest Passage, as well as the existence of a giant western sea that separated the Pacific. This map was reprinted and copied, including Francois Santini's version, which included an image of a Kamchatkan in an oval frame, a notable depiction of an indigenous person from the Circumpolar North. Broadbent's photographs, Mercator's, Corneli's, and Bois's maps, all are reminders that indeed things look different here at 70 degrees north latitude. There are days when the sea unfurls as a vast sheet of brilliant blue. On others, it is the color of wet ash, a gray directionless blur defined only by a distant mountain, a fog bank, or even an iceberg. This is most dangerous, of course. When the air begins to warm in the spring months, so does the water around the icebergs. There is some amount of melting. These giant fortresses of ice shed layers and break apart into pieces. The wayward pieces drift in icy currents that choke the narrowest straits, making passage dangerous for any vessel, even ones with iron prows, in search of that elusive northwest passage. In written accounts by the earliest Arctic explorers, this search was anything but exciting. Crews plunged into extended periods of abject boredom. Some expeditions were one-way voyages. Ships left their port, captains and crews celebrated, and their voyage continued until the reports stopped and the envoys no longer brought word of their progress. They disappeared, only to be followed by more expeditions whose sole purpose was not to discover unknown lands, but rather to recover the remains of previous crews. Imagine a sailor on one of these expeditions standing watch, ice pike in hand, noticing strange things floating along the water on the sides of the boats. They may be pieces of ice frosted with rings of red algae, or in the middle of an ice field, the sailor may see a hole used by seals to gulp air after a long dive. They may be startled by one dart bobbing up and down. He reaches for it with an ice pick, praying that what he's seeing is not a human body. He brings it closer to the ship and now sees that it is part of a tree with a branch that still has large, thin leaves that flop in the air like dry oilcloth. And a short distance away, a partially sunken piano drifts, one leg sticking up from the water as if in a kind of rigor mortis. These things may have been thrown away, or they may have been the remains of a shipwreck. The sailor even imagines that these things may have been flung into the water in some faraway places like the tropics, Central America perhaps, where the jungle runs into the ocean. In a time of heavy rain, a river swelled and overran its banks. A wave of rushing, muddy water carried houses off their foundations and threw them onto the rocks. They burst into pieces, strewn about in rushing waters that empty into the ocean. A warm current takes over, churning the massive debris with colder waters flowing upwards from the southern hemisphere. It curves upwards, hugging the coast, moving up the parallels like rungs on a ladder. Higher and higher, they go up to colder realms. The debris field moves up along the Aleutian chain through the Bering Strait and drifts ever so slowly to the east. It turns south, and another debris field that flows between huge sheets of ice through a freezing ocean where a sailor lunges an ice pike into the water after seeing something strange floating in the waters before him. Far above the 70th parallel, accounts vary as to what one may actually find here. Some believe that there's no ice here. The waters are actually warmer, heated by the flue of a giant undersea volcano. It is an unknown land that went by various names. The northernmost Algonquin people called it Arakoth, their word for sky. It is an appropriate name, for there are moments when it is difficult to find the horizon. The sky is infinite. The sun makes shallow transits, light blazing at severe oblique angles that can blind those not wearing smoked glass eyepieces. In the winter, the overcast sky hangs like a leaden plate, and the only thing that separates Earth from sky is a dull yellowish band of light that runs roughly along the horizon. Sailors call this Iceblink, a word that began to be used in the early days of polar exploration, a light previously unseen, viewed as the world that described it. This is the light depicted in Broadbent's photographs, a light that in some sense bears the signs of amateur photography or improperly sensitized plates. Skies appear overexposed, yellowed by the albumin process, which is to say that they appear almost as ice, images locked in time and space by dint of the photographic printing process. But there are instances when these photographs document something altogether. And as onlookers, we have to imagine ourselves the way that C. Auguste Dupin, the detective anti-hero of Edgar Allan Poe's Murders in the Rue Morgue, which is to say that we have to see things not directly, but obliquely, to let our peripheral vision expand our purview, for even if we look at something askance, it becomes sharper, more comprehensible. Among some of the most revealing photographs in Broadbent's inventory are those that show the beginnings of environmental change. Consider this photograph of Juno, taken from the gunwale of the revenue cutter Bear. At first glance, we note that this image is in pretty poor condition. The subject itself, the buildings, the streets, the piers, they appear sharp enough, and yet there's a haze surrounding the image, which at first may be an indication that the albumin has oxidized. More likely, it is a sign of poor mounting. The glue adhesive used to attach to photographic print may have been made from animal material, or gelatin, or even isinglass, which is made from dried sturgeon bladders. Whatever the substance, it is clear that it reacted with the chemicals on the albumin print. Look within the encircling blur, and something else begins to appear. For there, beyond the roof lines, withering stumps stand among felled trees, and it is a scene that repeats itself in more of Broadbent's photographs. Standing on a hill near Point Wilson, a peninsula at the very base of the Admiralty Peninsula, Broadbent captures a scene of near devastation. For here there are more felled trees and expanses of clear land, all flanking a timbering road that cuts a swath through the elevation. It's an eerie scene, perhaps even foretelling the cataclysmic airburst caused by a meteorite entering the atmosphere above the Tunguska River in Russia in 1908. Images of seal rookeries are followed by a faded print of Dutch Harbor, home to a seal fur processing factory belonging to the North American fur country. It was once a Russian fur trading post. And these are all images capturing moments when natural habitats are cleared for human settlements, sites where flora and fauna will be converted to capital. Yet the revenue cutter bear was also part of rescue missions and conservation efforts. A notable instance occurred in 1892. Fearing a complete decimation of the local reindeer population along the Alexander Archipelago and the Admiralty Peninsula, purchase agents as well as the Agent of Education in Alaska arranged for the revenue cutter bear to transfer entire herds of reindeer from Siberia. Broadbent documented the herds in their Siberian habitat as well as their loading onto the deck of the revenue cutter bear. Now, I want to return to these images, these printed photographs of indigenous people of the Circumpolar North. As I mentioned, these images of Tlingit and Inuit people are all characterized by distinct blurring. This is not, as with the faded borders of landscapes, evidence of poor technique. There are, as I suggested, instances where the subject is refusing to be a subject, denying the photographer the opportunity to capture an instance. It is now at least 20 years since Edward Muybridge's photographs of the horses Oxen and Silent G hovering in midair, frozen in mid-gallop. 20 years since Etienne Ramírez borrowed Jules Jansen's technique of using photosensitized rotating discs to photograph the elusive transit of Venus, now reconfigured, mounted to a service rifle and converted into a photographic gun to ensnare a bird in mid-flight by shooting it. There are instances where illusion of motion is broken down into individual, measurable, quantifiable instances. But with Broadbent's images, the illusion of motion is inadvertently preserved, or rather, the indigenous men, women, and children are caught in their own state of flux. However, as Ariel Azaleh has suggested, these do not make them impervious to the processes of institutional labeling and quantification, to their transformation into unwilling subjects of a colonial apparatus. Such instances of blurring here, I believe, have another significance, especially when considering two related contexts for Broadbent's photographs. They were all made while on patrol, or rather, they document excursions to and from a ship. So rather than ruminating on the fact that Broadbent's photographs are a record of moving back and forth, I want to suggest that the revenue cutter bear was a physical presence in the legal sense. Ships were appurtenant to land, and this is because Article 3 of the United States Constitution extended federal jurisdiction to navigable waters. Moreover, the Act of 1794 also extended coastal territorial seas to 1 marine league, a distance that corresponded roughly to the distance traveled by a cannonball, a distance that was a rough equivalent of 3 nautical miles. By 1893, this 3 nautical mile limit was generally accepted as customary law and incorporated into the Bering Sea arbitration between the United States and England. The two countries disputed whether seal hunting could take place beyond the 3 nautical miles from the coastlines of Alaska. The United States claimed the waters as their own territories, thus setting their stage for revenue marine cutters, like the Baron Thomas Corwins, to seize British vessels in the open seas. This was in contravention to international law, so the United Kingdom argued. Citing the practices of local kayakers and hunters in these waters, British sealers and whalers asserted their right to pelagic hunting well beyond the 3 nautical mile limit. And yet the arbitration essentially codified the 3 nautical mile limit as customary international law. It was a different matter with federal courts, however. A year earlier, in the U.S. versus the James G. Swan, an admiralty jurisdiction case, the federal court for the Western District of Washington held that, quote, national dominion and sovereignty may be extended over the sea as well as over the land. As you can imagine, such issues take on additional significance, especially when given that a good portion of the region is covered by ice for most of the year. The issue is not that the ice stays in one point and extends the territorial waters of Alaska in a way that is predictable or coherent. It was the opposite. The ice broke off, gathered, and moved at the whims of currents and winds, making the enforcement of laws within and beyond the 3 nautical mile limit a difficult endeavor. Territory became physically elusive. This was pointed out in a report written in 1890 by Ensign Edward Simpson, a hydrographer aboard the USS Thetis on patrol on the northwest Alaskan coast. The report, called Report of Ice and Ice Movements in the Bering Sea and the Arctic Basin, portrays in exacting, and I would say insufferable detail, the formation of sheets of ice. How these sheets of ice migrate northward, only to break apart and drift again towards the south and crash into areas where young ice was forming. This was dangerous because as the ice moved fast, it could trap an unsuspecting vessel between formations of broken and new ice. The revenue cutter Bear was not spared from these kinds of contingencies. Broadbent even took photographs of his vessel while stuck in ice. The images are remarkable in that they show the stout, iron-proud ship subjected to the elements. Moreover, the ship appears appurtenant to the ice in the same way a building is moored to the ground. The Bear seems immobile, sessile, wrecked, and I can't help but wonder about the significance of the shipwreck to architecture. Way back in the day, many careers ago, I actually studied and practiced maritime law. It was a specialization in the truest sense of the word. Its tangled skein of laws and lore were esoteric enough to sustain my interest, and it was a simple choice, really. Should I bog myself in the minutiae of corporate and securities law, or should I read about naval battles, perilous salvage operations, sunken treasures, and hot pursuit across international waters? It was clear to me. It thus follows that as a piece of chattel, a vessel is subject to the same matrix of property laws that would extend to real estate. A ship was literally a floating piece of property, a mobile island, so to speak. And these rights also extended to the arena of public international law, where a ship enjoyed certain amounts of territorial sovereignty. A ship was therefore governed by the laws of its flag of convenience. A ship flying an American flag was covered by US law, a French by French law, and so on. What my law professors failed to convey to me was that a ship was also a place. The vessel's riggings, superstructures, etc., all comprise a spatial configuration addressing a particular programmatic need. In other words, a ship can be thought of in architectural terms. It is no surprise then, when the Austrian architect Hans Hollein declared that everything is architecture, he chose to depict a gigantic nuclear-powered aircraft carrier in the middle of a grassy landscape in service of his points. But there are more examples. At the 1920 Housing Congress in Lyon, for instance, the French architect and hygienist Adolphe Augustin Rey contrasted the Singer building's verticality to the horizontality of the Cunard liner Lusitania and the Hudson River excursion steamer Hendrik Hudson, claiming that, quote, in America, the giganticness of the vertical is nothing compared to the giganticness of the horizontal. An eloquent statement of a ship's architecturalness also comes from the Australian historian Greg Denning. In his 1993 book, Mr. Bly's Bad Language, Passion, Power, and Theater on the Bounty, Denning provides an in-depth look at the events leading to Fletcher Christian's 1789 uprising aboard the HMS Bounty. Denning rightly portrays the insurrection as one with a particularly spatial origin. On the Bounty's fateful expedition, its officers' compartments were fitted to carry breadfruit and other plants, a situation that surely infuriated the Bounty's subordinate officers. The Bounty was therefore more than a ship. It was a space of habitation. Denning writes, quote, space and the language to describe it make it a ship. Space was inseparable from the authority it displayed and the relationships it enclosed. The quarterdeck in naval parlance was a place. The upper deck part of the mainmast. It was also a social group. Those who had the privilege of walking the quarterdeck and using the space associated with it, usually the great cabin and the wardroom. From the earliest times, the quarterdeck had been a sacred place for the shrines and gods of the sea and the seamen. By the 18th century, the quarterdeck was sacred to the presence of sovereign power and displays of etiquette and privilege. It was the captain's territory, his to walk alone, his to speak from but not to be spoken to unless he wished it. But the captain himself also owed the quarterdeck our deference. He too saluted the shrine as a sign that he was a subordinate to the power that others saluted in him. The quarterdeck embodied this commission from the king. It was the space of his sovereign's power, and all its trivial gestures and etiquette were its geography. The quarterdeck for the officers of a fighting ship was a space for very deep plays. It was there that an officer was expected to stand exposed, shielded only by his honor, when others on the ship may fight with more protection. The dread possibility, but also the hope that any officer may have a treading where captains trod touched even the most trivial gesture with solemnity. The HMS Bounty was Captain Bligh's literal and figurative cosmos. It was also an architectural object freighted with power. This view is not uncommon with Herman Melville's passages describing the Pequod as a maritime abattoir, a seagoing slaughterhouse plowing the mains in search of more emigrants, all in service of the captain's maddening quest. But more on ships, architecture, and landscapes. A conceptual triad that comes to mind, especially with thinking of Caspar David Friedrich's The Sea of Ice from 1824. There are two things to note about this painting. One is the scene, which shows jagged plains of ice jutting and tugging into each other at various angles. And then there's the shipwreck itself, a scene of a failed polar expedition. The painting exemplifies many of the things we associate with Romanticism in German art, nature dominating humankind, for instance, a slowing of emotions, horror, sublime perhaps. Yet the brute architecturalness of Broadbent's photo is a reminder of the ways that architectural histories have looked to the histories of ships as crucial to understanding the importance of sight. The architect and historian Julien David Leroy, for instance, wrote entire histories of ships. He relied on ancient geographic texts by historians like Eusebius to identify the ancient Phoenicians as one of the first fish-eating people. Eusebius was also one of the first writers to provide an account of the first ship, and this account was a retelling of a fragment by an earlier source, the Phoenician chronicler Sanchoniathon, a story in which the seafarer Usus, stranded on a beach, creates a floating shelter out of tree branches and logs to protect himself from a storm. A version of the story appears in a 1547 engraving to a French illustrated tradition of Vitruvius. Thing is, Leroy did not have to scour ancient texts to find this fragment. A version of it also appeared in the first volume of Antoine-Yves Gauguet's On the Origins of Laws, Arts, and the Sciences from 1758. But in Leroy's retelling, this tale gains architectural significance. He explains how the ancient Roman architect Vitruvius basically borrows Sanchoniathon's story of seafaring and applies it to his own study of architecture. So imagine then a history of architecture that involves not just ships, but ice. Right? It is tempting to begin a story with, say, Hippocrates on airs, waters, and places, but my point of departure is a little surprising even to me, because I may begin with Jules Verne. Blink, and you may miss a moment of architectural and literary synergy in the pages of Jules Verne's polar adventure from 1866, The Adventures of Captain Hatteras. The titular captain, at the helm of the English sloop Forward, encounters the wreck of the Porpoise, part of a failed American expedition to reach the North Pole. The mercury plunges, the winds are austere, polar bears stalk the Iceblink, and facing a perilous drop in the mercury, the crew decide to fashion a shelter out of the Porpoise. And this is where Dr. Clawbonny, the ship's doctor, reveals that he is a student of architectural history, kind of, sort of, and in a feat of eidetic memory, recalls the engraved plates from Georg Wolfgang Kraft's book on the Ice Palace, built in St. Petersburg on the banks of the Neva in 1740. This ice house was first proposed by Vasily Tatishev to Empress Anna Ivanovna. It was later built by Kraft, a physicist and an engineer, and Pyotr Europkin, an architect famous for his urban design schemes for St. Petersburg. Kraft and Europkin built the house from blocks of ice floating on the Neva, and it was a tribute to Empress Anna, who appointed Europkin as court architect and established the Imperial Academy of Sciences at St. Petersburg. In Verne's novel, Clawbonny tells the crew, quote, "It was magic, my friends. The house built by order of the Empress Anne, where she held the wedding of one of her jesters in 1740, was about the same size as ours. But along its front were 6 ice cannons lined up on their carriages They were fired several times with balls and powder and did not break up. There were also mortars sculpted for explosives of 60 pounds. If need be, we could build up formidable artillery. There is bronze nearby, for it falls to us from the sky. But taste and art triumph, especially in the pediment of the palace, adorned with ice statues of great beauty. From the front flight steps displayed flower and orange tree pots, also of ice. On the right stood an enormous elephant which squirted water in the daytime and burning naphtha at night. We could make a complete menagerie if we wanted. Continuing this history, we may take a detour and consider the 1943 Airways to Peace exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art. The show, an exploration of Air Age geography, was developed by Monroe Wheeler with assistance of Wendell Wilkie. Herbert Beyer was the exhibition designer and consulted with various photographers and experts in designing an inside-out globe, a version of the world. I'm just gonna wrap up. A version of the world that turned into a kind of tholos with an oculus at the very top corresponding to the polar regions. While gathering the materials for this globe, Beyer, Wheeler, and another expert, Richard Eads Harrison, sought cartographic materials that would make a visual impact, even if this meant sacrificing cartographic accuracy for the sake of making an argument. Polar projections would become the preferred means for showing how aviation created a new, visually oriented geographical regime. And for this reason, Beyer and Wheeler mounted polar projections by Wilhelm Stefansson, the Canadian explorer and scientist famous for his writings about the Arctic, whose most popular book, The Adventures of Wrangel Island, contained a highly regarded polar projection of the Northern Hemisphere. These images, or these materials, asked museum goers to view the world differently, and so did Broadbent's photographs. There's so many ways to describe his inventory of images from the Bering Sea Patrol. Some of the images are quite beautiful, some are downright rote, and all seem to remind us that Broadbent was not an artist, and yet through his camera eye, we are catching a glimpse of a world of blurs, streaks, and transitions from earth to sky, from water to ice, and we saw tonight how Broadbent's photographs of people differed in resolution, how when compared to the pristine resolution of images of American sailors and crewmen, those of indigenous people of the Circumpolar North varied in definition. Their faces are streaked and blurred, just a reminder that in this region, these people defied characterization. They were not grouped into recognizable tribes by the US Department of the Interior until the 1960s. These are people whose lineages can be traced through haplogroup QM3 to their ancestors who crossed the Bering Strait somewhere around 20,000 BCE.